Well, I took a job at the University of Minnesota in 1988, and the job was outreach with the University of Minnesota Extension. And my home department was the Department of Food Science and Nutrition over on St. Paul campus. So I had the opportunity in my academic work to travel the state. The university is a land-grant university, and that means that it involves not only what goes on campus, but also involves the citizens of the state. And in fact, the university has an outreach network that when I first began had faculty in every county. Now we have about 12 district offices around the state. But the purpose of that network is to do outreach, to provide non-credit informal education to the citizens of Minnesota. Now there are a couple of different competing narratives around what the emphasis of that education should be. The way it was explained to me was that I was an expert in food and nutrition, and so should provide the citizens with the latest research, the latest understandings of food and health. And I remember back to the second day on the job, I had a chance to meet with an extension administrator with whom I would work fairly closely. And she told me, "Craig, we need to show behavior change. Our programs in food and nutrition have to demonstrate behavior change." And I said to her, "Well, I don't see my job that way at all." I said, "I see myself as an educator." And I said, "I know something about the science of nutrition, and I think I'm in position to help people interpret that science so that they can apply that to their lives in ways that they feel is appropriate. But I really don't see myself in position to make judgments for others about what they should be eating and what constitutes quality of life for them. I feel that that's overstepping my bounds." And she just responded, "Well, Craig, we need behavior change." So that introduced me to an institutional dynamic that I've been able to resist my entire career. Many people in my position, which is often referred to as an extension specialist, in my case, food and nutrition. Many people across the country in those positions take responsibility for changing people's eating habits. And I'm one of the very few who have chosen deliberately to resist that impulse. As a result, I got interested in critical thinking because I felt that for people to understand the science, to be able to put it in the context of their own lives, they had to be able to at least to some degree, think through what the implications of this science might mean for them. And the idea of critical thinking, and it was actually a term that aligned with my educational philosophy. And so I quickly, once I heard that term and started researching that term, I recognized that that was a whole philosophy that I carried into my work that really aligned with what I thought my role should be as a faculty member doing not only outreach but research at a land-grant university. And so that's the way I approach my work. And I carried that philosophy. And I also carried that philosophy to many different communities in Minnesota, not just traditional audiences of Extension, the Extension Network, but I traveled to communities that were most affected by diet and health suffering, diet and health disease, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, cancer. And I found some fairly interesting things. First of all, I wasn't always welcome in those communities, which I was taken aback because everywhere I had gone within the nuances of the Extension Network, I was well received. I was welcomed as a university resource, someone who would take time to visit and talk with people. But that introduced me to the idea that the university wasn't always seen as a positive force in people's lives, depending on the community that I was entering. I also found that, for example, when I went to some of the tribal communities around Minnesota, there was a lot of interest in food and nutrition issues. But then when I turned back to our dietetics program that operates within our department, there was no representation from indigenous people at all. So no American Indian participation in our dietetics programs. Yet when I continued to visit these communities, people were very interested in food and health relationships. They were particularly interested in recovering some of their traditional foods as part of dealing with the health issues they experience. I couldn't understand why there was no participation in our dietetics programs, our professional programs, when in fact there was so much interest in the community. And that was a question that I held. I suppose I was a little bit unique in that regard, because many others, although they were aware of that, that question seemed to sort of roll off their backs. It wasn't one that was particularly worth attending to. But I felt differently. I felt that I had to try to understand why there was that disparity.
So much in what you say that I relate to from different pieces of my life. I suppose when I was growing up in Forest City, Minnesota, one of the great beneficiaries of University Extension, the focal point of health education was the food pyramid, which I take it now is regarded as an artifact of the agribusiness industry with intensely misleading information about what to eat.
Well, it's an artifact of the biomedical view of food and health. It's not, yes, it is agribusiness and it is a symbol of politics, but even before that, the shape and the pyramid structure itself comes out of a biomedical approach to understanding food and health. And when I would travel to tribal communities, one of the things that I heard about that symbol, well, there's that damn triangle, it doesn't work for us. We we don't see anything in that triangle that helps us to create health in our communities. So that gave me another bit of insight that what I was delivering or disseminating in the outreach model of the university might not be universally applicable. It might not be universally appreciated.
Another thing that happened to me growing up was I would go with my dad to deliver milk, and another artifact of the university extension was on racks there, all of the information about what to do with crops and chickens and pigs and all sorts of things. So far as I can tell from my friends who study this thing, that all would be pretty much regarded as misguided today, you know, some 50 years after my dad and I. In other words, people took that stuff very seriously, maybe too seriously, because it was the only game in town. If you started out with chickens, this was your Bible. It was free. It had pictures of chickens on it that were kind of pretty. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of hunger for being told what to do. Mm-hmm. And people, I mean, I saw fertilizer, you know, the beginning of fertilizing. My dad is a great advocate of fertilizing and showing people the difference between the fertilized field and the unfertilized field. You know, I mean, that it was like a dream, educator's dream of these ideas taking hold and changing behavior.
Right.
And of course, the problem was that now the folks who travel around the country are trying to change the behavior back. And, you know, it's been a bad year or a bad decade, I suppose, for public health information. I mean, you don't have to read very deep to see study after study mm-hmm. reversed by larger studies.
Right, right.
So I'm wondering, I mean, I appreciate your approach, your critical thinking approach, but I'm wondering how you, if you could say a little more about how you think about what a university representative on subjects of nutrition, like nutrition, can and should do.
Right.
Given, you know, the experience we've had over the last 50 years.
Well, again, going back to when I first took this job, I inherited the role of expert. And at that time, there was still a great deal of cultural authority, as you describe, in what the university advocated. And now that conflicted with my understanding of the science, because what people want also very much, what the people are hungry for, is certainty. And I also remember a woman from the School of Public Health who said to me about a month on the job, she said, because I was advocating a critical thinking approach, and her response was, well, Craig, when people ask what time it is, they don't want to know how the watch works. And I said, well, Becky, what if we don't really know what time it is? What if we only know within a certain gap what time it is. To what extent do we disclose that? Or to what extent do we feign certainty for the return of confidence that we hope will lead to a change in behavior? And so that was the game as I saw it in the first several years of my work here, the late 80s into the early 90s. The reason that I was hired was my work with cholesterol metabolism. And back in the late 80s was the height of the whole attention to cholesterol, all the publicity around the evils of different fats, the evils of too much dietary cholesterol. And being a nutrition scientist with a laboratory background, again, a lot of test tube centrifuges, I understood the limitations of what science had to say about the certainty of benefits for people to restrict their cholesterol intake, for people to restrict saturated fat, for people to switch to polyunsaturated fats, vegetable oils that at that time contained a lot of what we now know as trans fatty acids, margarine, that sort of thing. And I understood all of the uncertainties around that. And the conflict for me was, do I come clean with all the vagaries and complexities? Or do I distill into a nice, simple message that helps people make a behavior change that will allow us to look like we're doing our job at the university? So I took that all very seriously. I regarded it as an ethical issue in how I approach my work.
And what was your learning curve with that? What did you try? What happened?
Well, what I did was I operated out of principles that I felt I could maintain a sense of integrity. And that meant that my message was a bit messy. It was uncertain. I offered in sound bites where we were in a world of sound bites, we still are, where people hate on the one hand this, on the other hand that, especially when people want certainty. So I fell back on this idea of critical thinking, that a lot of the questions really are grounded in a dimension of uncertainty, and that what we have to do is to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity and learn how to tolerate a certain amount of ambiguity in our lives. And that while science has something to say about what we should be doing, it doesn't always provide us definitive answers in the way maybe we would like to see.
And how did people respond to that?
Well, I think there were a number of people, a fairly sizable minority, who appreciated what I was trying to do. I think there were a lot of people who maybe even a majority, who want simple answers, and what I was saying was just too messy. They would maybe get lost in what I was saying, or maybe they liked what I was saying but didn't feel they were in a position to think critically about what they were eating, what they were doing. That maybe, given the complexity of people's lives, if they were going to do any critical thinking, it would be in their pursuits in life, what they thought was most important, their occupation, their dealing with their life crises. And at that point in time, even though there was a lot of interest in food and health, it was more at the superficial level. I think this again preceded the whole local foods movement. It preceded an erosion of trust in our large food companies. At that time, people didn't question so much what General Mills was producing or what the latest products from Land O'Lake was. It was much more about the newest and the greatest and the best and the brightest and shiniest. But I think over time, people have started to recognize that this is more important. But I think people, rather than coming at it so much from a critical thinking perspective, although critical thinking is a part of it, I think people recognize that the latest science and technology can offer a lot of glitz and a lot of new foods and a lot of new products, but that in that development process, people lost a connection that they maybe once had with their food. If you think back, for example, to, we're getting close to Thanksgiving. By the time this airs, I think it will be in the Thanksgiving weekend, but think about a family Thanksgiving dinner at Grandma's house back in childhood. Think about that connection to people, that connection to food on the table. I think in our effort to provide the latest and greatest, the newest superfood, what any person would want, what consumers would want at any time of the year, at any place, any time they want it. In an effort to fulfill those kinds of demands, we may have lost a deeper connection with food that I think started to manifest itself in things like the movement to organic foods and the movement to local foods and the movement to try to reconnect, maybe reestablish an understanding of food as relationship, a connection to place. I think that that's part of what has happened over the last, as I look back over the last 10 or 15 years. I think that has happened. I think we've been very quick in our professions in food science and nutrition to look at every problem as having a technical solution. And I think that while people appreciate that and understand that and respond to that in the United States, unlike in many other places of the world, people here still see something that they want to protect in terms of their relationship to food.
Once upon a time, many years ago, I did a talk for a conference of home ec teachers. I think this is probably about the time you took your job, or maybe a few years before. And there was a woman from the meat lobby there to make sure that meat wasn't bad-mouthed. Not that I think anyone was inclined to. And these guys and the food producers we're providing all sorts of helpful classroom aids that pretty much made it superfluous for the teacher to prepare a lesson because it was all there. And I knew that somebody at the state nutrition office, somebody in the upper places, and I called her and said, "Someone's got to do a newsletter here. I mean, all the information's coming from the food guys. There's no counter voice." And she said, "You touch the milk people, you touch the juice people, you die."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a very odd thing coming from somebody in the top of the state food chain.
Well,
educational food chain.
she learned her job well, didn't she?
Well, the punchline for this story is, I'm surprised you're still employed. I mean,
Well, there's this thing called tenure.
I see, and it applies to folks like you.
Well, it does, and in fact, this isn't the biggest battle I've fought, because, again, getting back to my work with tribal communities, I started to develop relationships with them, and it came out of the work that our college in over on St. Paul campus, and the college is College for Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences. Back then it was just called the College of Agriculture. But that college has a long history of cultivating wild rice, developing and domesticating the wild rice. And that was in response to a group of landholders, wealthy landholders up in northern Minnesota, who had wetlands that they wanted to put into production. And they wanted the University of Minnesota to work with the state grain, wild rice, to domesticate it, to cultivate it, so that it could be developed like corn or soybeans or any other domestic crop. And the university did that. This group formed an organization and lobbied the legislature, and the legislature appropriated funds to the university to develop a program for domestication of wild rice. It turned out to be a very successful program. Wild rice varieties were developed. They were initiated, planted in Minnesota. And then after that proved successful, growers in California said, well, that looks like a good deal. We get 2 growing seasons with our climate instead of 1 here in Minnesota. We'll just take that over. And so they did. And they, in turn, were very successful in producing a lot of cultivated rice. But all of that cultivated development, in essence, interfered greatly with the tribal relationship to wild rice. And they would hand harvest from lakes and rivers, streams, where, as their term for the rice was the monomen, where the monomen was growing naturally. And they have a special relationship to that rice. It's part of their prophecies. It's part of who the Anishinaabe are that inhabit the upper Great Lakes region. And so they had a very special relationship to that rice. That was ignored. In fact, there was very little, if any, tribal involvement in any of this agenda that the University of Minnesota had taken. And it disrupted a lot of the economy in tribal communities, particularly pre-casino days. But what was more significant was about the time that I took my job, the agricultural geneticists, the agronomists, were starting to develop tools of molecular biology, and they were starting to map the genome of the wild rice. And that raised the specter in the eyes of tribal communities of genetic engineering, just like what was happening with canola and soybean. And the tribal communities feared this greatly as a desecration of what they saw as a sacred gift to their people, to all people, but especially to their people. And they saw their role as protecting the integrity of this gift. The university paid very little attention to any of that. And that really lit a tinderbox under what was an exploitive relationship. That the tribal community saw the university as an instrument of colonization, much as many aspects of modern society were instruments of colonization with respect to their way of life, their lifestyle. And there was not a lot of understanding and consciousness of tribal perspectives, tribal understandings of how to live in this land in harmony with everything that is, rather than a more European approach of control over nature as the summit of our value system. And so tribal communities were, in essence, made invisible with respect to the research agenda of the University of Minnesota. That also posed an ethical problem for me, because I was starting to develop personal relationships with people from tribal communities who I knew to be intelligent. I knew that they understood enough about modern science to recognize threats when they saw it. And I also looked back on our college and saw very little interest, very little concern about trying to understand where tribal communities were coming from. It was almost as if we have the research expertise, we have the knowledge, we're the only real game in town if you want to understand what's going on with wild rice. There was very little understanding that tribal communities who had been caretakers of this plant for centuries before we inhabited the state had anything legitimate to contribute with respect to knowledge about this plant. And that kind of arrogance and that kind of hubris was very bothersome to me, and I saw that as an abandonment of critical thinking. And I felt that if the university was going to do good science, and we were going to be exemplars of critical thinking, that we had a lot of work to do, that we have to learn how to engage with people who bring a very different set of values, a very different worldview, a very different understanding of how humans relate to the natural world. And that work did bring me some difficulty. It did bring me some serious dissonance. I remember an episode in about 2001. I'd been working with people from White Earth and other tribal communities for about 7 or 8 years to try to, I'd started some classes where we brought tribal community members in to speak to classes, to provide their perspective on what was being done. And I was summoned to the dean's office with my department head. And the dean sat me down with my department head and he said, "Craig, I notice you've been struggling." And I said, "Well, Chuck, you're right, I have been struggling because there's no template for how to do the kind of work that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create my own path here for how to do this kind of work, how to navigate these very different perspectives, these very different worldviews." And he said, "Well, Craig, I just want you to know that the university has counseling services available." And I said to him, "Oh, you mean Jim Mayland?" I said, "Yeah, I've already been to see Jim. You want me to go see Jim again?" I said, "I'm happy to see Jim. I'm always interested in learning more about myself." He thought he was trying to guide me in the right direction. And as I was getting into this work, I, of course, could feel all of this tension around whether I was abdicating my traditional roles and responsibilities in pursuit of what I thought was a larger social injustice. And so I went to see, this was in about 97, I went to see university counseling services and was given a battery of tests and had a sit down with Jim Mayland, and who was on staff there to help with faculty issues. And I talked with him. I told him what I was doing and what I was up against, and I said, very few people in my department or my college understand where I'm going and what I'm doing. And he gave me the battery of tests, and afterwards he sat down. He says, "Well, Craig," he said, you're resistant to depression. That's not an issue." He said, "Well, what I would suggest, though, is at least for a percentage of your time, you do something that your colleagues understand." And so I tried doing that. Again, my research was test tube centrifuges, laboratory animals, and I went back to doing that, but I couldn't ethically resolve sacrificing hamsters to understand the cholesterol-lowering capacity of pentasands that are found within certain wheat varieties. I had shifted in my understanding of what kinds of knowledge is important, what kinds of knowledge might be useful and meaningful for society, what kinds of knowledge might really make a difference in terms of creating a better world, versus the kinds of knowledge that keeps professionals going. And so I was in the middle of a lot of that kind of tension.
What have you been able to accomplish with respect to your work with Native peoples?
Well, this might sound very interesting, but I would say the biggest accomplishment has been self-understanding. That I've working across cultural difference has helped me to understand myself and my own situation and my own history much better. Just to give you a little bit of insight, science, as I was taught through my bachelor's, master's, and PhD, was never presented as a cultural knowledge system. It was presented as, if you want to understand reality, the material world as it really exists, this is the way to do it. It was presented in the context of, from a philosophical perspective, a sort of naive realism. And I was never asked to take the history of science. I was never asked to take philosophy of science. I was never given any sort of tools by which I could put what I was being taught into a larger social or cultural context. So it was just handed to me as this is reality, absent any context. The way in which knowledge is produced using experimental methods is very much a process of decontextualized knowledge. So we strip away all of this other stuff in order to create an environment wherein we can exert control and carefully study the experimental method. So we are masters of decontextualization, which is fine if I'm in a laboratory in an ivory tower. But I was also working throughout the state, developing relationships with people. I was not allowed to decontextualize in my relationships with tribal communities. I had to bring my full self as a human being. I had to understand the history of the university with tribal communities. I had to understand the history of European settlers and ancestors, even though they weren't my ancestors. From the standpoint of the tribal community, they were my people that had colonized this state. I had to understand all of that history. I had to recognize that in any interaction I stepped into with those communities, I was bringing all of that history with me. Even though, of course, my own cultural approach is to see myself as an individual isolated from all of that. That's not how I was seen interacting with those communities. So those interactions taught me that I carry all of that with me into an intercultural interaction. And that I have to take responsibility for that, even if I don't like it, even if would like to consider myself a guy wearing a white hat as opposed to a black hat. I have to own all of that because that's what I represent. And for me to act with integrity, for me to work with integrity in those communities, I have to accept that reality, and I have to work with that reality. I have to own that history. And then I have to work in ways that attempts to transform that history into something that's better. I have to try to find ways of interacting, find ways of navigating across culture that allow people to maintain their cultural integrity, to maintain their cultural identity, while I maintain my cultural integrity and my identity. And I believe it's possible for people to interact across these cultural collisions, these cultural divisions, if you will, in ways where everyone can benefit. And so I strive to learn how to do that. It's difficult work. It's a lifetime of work. But in order for me to do that, I have to know myself first. I have to understand who I am. And then I can try to find those new paths of working together. So it's less about helping indigenous communities eat better. They have their own knowledge of their own foods. They understand food sovereignty a lot better than I do. They understand what it means to have an indigenous food system much better than I do. They understand the idea of dietary decolonization better than I ever will. But I can at least empathize with those dimensions, empathize with those concerns, understand that history, and help support them however I can. And I can't know in advance how I can be helpful to them. I have to enter into personal relationship, develop those relationships, and then simply ask, how can I be a resource to you?
This conversation is so similar to one I had a couple of years ago with a Peace Corps guy being sent to West Africa, allegedly to improve agriculture, and he came to largely the same kind of conclusion. And then a little later had the possibility, the opportunity in another role to kind of to offer some protection to traditional agriculture from the next crew of bright boys from Massachusetts who were in there with with three agronomy textbooks and a lot of bad ideas. I'm wondering have you had any success in protecting the communities you value from the next round of bright boys from St. Paul?
Right. Well, that's a very good question, and I believe that that's a big part of my responsibility. I believe that's a big part of my responsibility. I see the vast majority of my work working with my peers, trying to help them understand something of what I've been able to learn. I've recently been a part of a gift from the Shakopee Midwakaton Sioux community to the University of Minnesota. It's part of a campaign called Seeds of Native Health. This is a campaign that the Shakopee community has started, and they've made a number of gifts to a number of different organizations, but one of the gifts that they made was to the University of Minnesota. And part of my work with that gift is attempting to create a work, a volume, that addresses the obstacles between dietary researchers, nutrition science researchers on one hand, and Native communities on the other. So I'll have a chance to talk about and to share my own experiences share what I see as obstacles, as how we need to reconsider certain dimensions of our science and our practice, how maybe we've not paid enough attention to the, what I term, hidden subjectivities that lie beneath our scientific practice. For example, our valuing to the extreme control over nature as part of the scientific enterprise over a more indigenous approach that would value more harmony with nature. Are there adjustments we can make if we were to study ourselves a little more carefully in terms of how we do our science, how we come to our science? I'm also, as part of that gift, I'm going to attempt to instigate a session in one or more scientific meetings where we talk about these things. Now, to date, when I have suggested to a trusted peer who understands maybe 40 or 50% of what I'm up to, who is a department chair in nutrition science at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I ask him, do you see any inclination toward this kind of questioning, this kind of examination of what we're doing, this kind of self-critique? And I've asked him this for the last 4 or 5 years, and every year he says, people don't want to muddy the waters. They have a good thing going. Why would they make life so messy for themselves? Part of it is that we have never developed the capacity to have this kind of discourse within our discipline. Our capacity for this kind of conversation has atrophied because we've been so decontextualized, we bracket all this stuff out, and we don't know what to do with it. And so I've accepted this gift with the idea that I've told them that I would hold 2 of these sessions in scientific meetings over the next couple of years. So we'll see what happens.
You've mentioned a number of movements that have arisen since you took that job in 1988 that might seem somewhat promising for a shift in attitude. The local foods movement, a kind of collective suspicion or sort of suspicious reflex about corporate interventions in agriculture, suspicions about new products that were not common when I was growing up. The new product was wonderful because it was new. Now you read the label for anything new. I'm wondering what that means with respect to the response of your informant in Nebraska. Has any of this cultural change worked its way into the food science people?
Well, it is working its way in, less in the food science discipline than it is in the nutrition discipline. And I'll give you an example. Every 5 years, by legislative mandate, the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services are supposed to get together and reissue a latest version of dietary guidelines for Americans. That's, the first one was 1980, and it's done every 5 years. There's a scientific committee that's selected to review the data, to update those dietary guidelines, and to make those dietary guidelines available. They're the basis for the food guide pyramid, for what is now My Plate, for all federal policy around nutrition, food, and health. So the 2015 committee assembled a couple of years back, and earlier this year released an initial draft of those dietary guidelines, wherein they advocated that dietary choices should also be mindful of the environmental or ecological footprint of those choices. So there was a committee of scientists, nutrition scientists, taught skillfully in the art of decontextualization, that managed to overcome those impulses enough to recognize the broader societal trends, the concerns over global warming, climate change, ecological impacts, to include that in the dietary guidelines, the first draft. So that's commendable. That's commendable progress. Unfortunately, as you alluded to earlier, the politics of food doesn't allow that kind of change so neat and clean. And in fact, the lobbies from the meat industries, the agricultural industries, killed that dimension of those dietary guidelines. In essence, they said, this is nutrition science. They're going way beyond the boundaries of nutrition science here. We should stick to what constitutes a healthy diet and leave it at that. And by God, meat provides important protein, iron, essential nutrients, and that's very much a part of a healthy diet.
I remember the person I met at this conference, she had a little tiny rubber piece of meat, which was the recommended serving size.
A deck of cards.
Yeah, and I always thought, this is a revolutionary message. If everybody who eats meat eats this little piece of rubber, we can get rid of most of the cows because they won't need them. I just so it's but of course, no, the meat industry couldn't survive with that level of consumption, I don't think.
Right. Well, and American consumers are highly conditioned in our palates. We are highly conditioned to favor, to like certain foods. And we are also highly conditioned to enjoy and to expect individual freedoms around those choices. And so the whole issue of eating healthy, the onus to a very large extent has historically been put on individual consumer choice. And the idea of adjusting policy, adjusting systems, i.e., as with smoking, is something that's very, very difficult to achieve. But things are starting to move more in that direction because, of course, Our food systems are what provide us with whatever we want, whenever we want. And the federal policies that support those systems have a large role in our ecological state of affairs, particularly in large agriculture states like here in Minnesota.